Today, I'd like to talk a bit about immigration coverage. First of all, I'd like to apologize for getting this to you so late in the week. I think that with this topic, next week's topic on coverage of race, and some of the topics later in the semester, it's really important to consider that there is no right or wrong as much as, or rather, that it depends more on your points of view and what you're bringing to the coverage in terms of your expectations and your ideas of fairness. I think that when we consider the issue of immigration, first of all, it's a major issue in many parts of the globe. Many nations are dealing with immigration. Should they welcome it? How would they control it? And so on. And we would look to the press to have a reasonable and fair accounting of the issue and how it's being handled. And I think the same is true in the United States. We know that many people have strong feelings about immigration. Many of them are in favor of it and acknowledge its many contributions to our culture. Many people have concerns about it. Many people fear it for a variety of reasons. And so, for any of us to sit down here in New York City and look at a range of media coverage, what is fair and what is reasonable? As I've said in other contexts, I don't think we can expect a single news organization, even a vast and complex one like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or CNN or Fox News or the big networks, to cover all different sides of an issue. Perhaps some will, and some will succeed some of the time, but with issues this complex, what I'm more concerned with is whether through a mixed news diet of relying on different sources, an audience can get a reasonable range of opinions. Now, when it comes to immigration, I think that there are different perspectives that people bring to a consideration of the issue. One, sort of a fundamental one, is economic, and that is, do the benefits of immigration outweigh the costs? And this has been debated and it has been studied. In fact, when I first came to Baruch 20 years ago, I was involved in a research project with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, working with a couple of economists there. And what we were trying to figure out was, how do you measure the benefits if they are hidden? And by hidden benefits, I mean there are many people who are undocumented. There are many people, not just immigrants, who are paid off the books. So all of those people have earnings, all of them, and I think we don't think about this so much, but every one of them, whatever your legal status, is a consumer purchasing items and services for themselves and their family. So how do you account for all this activity? It's easier, I think, historically and in the current moment, to weigh the costs of immigration, because we can see the number of people who are enrolling their children in public schools, who are seeking health services, whether it's through private practices, clinics, showing up at emergency rooms. So you can see those costs, and the benefits can be harder to measure, though I think economists have made a lot of inroads in that. And as you know, and this has been an issue with the census that's going on now, the Constitution stipulates that every person in the country should be counted. It makes no distinction between citizens and non-citizens. And so when we see those raw numbers, and we can only hope that they're accurate and full, we get a sense of the number of consumers in the country. And from that, we can derive certain estimates. There have been studies that show that many undocumented people do pay taxes on their earnings. They see it as a step towards earning legal status. So we know all that. But some of the concerns about immigration are not simply economic, and they are cultural. Before I move on to cultural, I want to just return to economic for a minute. About 5 or 6 years ago in Britain, one of the major polling companies there, which is called YouGov, which is sort of the equivalent to our Gallup poll, and this was before the Brexit vote, asked people what was the single economic issue they had the most concern with. And 80% of the people, of the British people who responded, said immigration and the fear that immigrants were coming in and stealing jobs from British people. And then another question asked, do you know of anyone who has lost a job to immigrants? And the answer in that case was under 20% said yes. So there seemed to be a measurable gap between people's economic fears and the economic reality that they and their friends and neighbors were experiencing. So I think that one issue this reminds us of is that there are other dimensions to the immigration issue rather than purely economic ones. And what I will call cultural ones are people who are concerned about the preservation of their values, about the values of their culture. Could be religious beliefs. It could be languages spoken. It could be family groupings and attitudes towards different issues in one's life. I think that over its 2 centuries, there have been times in the United States when there was a lot of opposition to immigration. You have probably read or heard that the Irish who emigrated here in great numbers in the 1840s, 1850s, into 1860s met a lot of discrimination. There are photos that survive from that era of stores that have signs on the front that say no dogs are Irish permitted. The subsequent huge waves of immigrants from Germany, elsewhere in Northern Europe, the great Jewish immigration, all of these met some resistance on some fronts and a welcome on other fronts. But some of the concerns that people seem to have, and this has always been a characteristic American concern, is whether people spoke English and were prepared to go to school in English and were conversant in English, could do business in English, could get a driver's license in English. And this was very important to many people, and it still is important to some people. And in some ways, I think the contrast with other nations, some other nations, is quite dramatic, because there are many nations in Europe that see bilingualism or multilingualism as a great asset. And here in the US, there have been many people who felt that part of the assimilation process should be that everybody becomes conversant in English. And I think that that issue is a very emotional one for people. Again, I don't think there's a right or wrong, but if you step back and consider, whether people can contribute to society, whether or not they speak English, perhaps then you have to fall back on economic analysis to see that. So when we look at press coverage, what are we looking for? Seems to me we would want some context. We would want some consideration of multiple sides of the story. I think that at least in the news organizations that we look at in this course, many of them, you might argue, are very sympathetic to immigration, and their coverage tends to reflect the needs of the immigrants and how they're treated and whether they are welcomed or not, and what some of the legal issues are. I think there's, at least in my view, there's less coverage of the concerns of people about immigration. And we saw in the last election, that there were many people for whom this was a hot button issue, and they were willing to vote, even eager to vote for candidates who would take a hard line against immigration. So do we understand them? Does the press in its rich variety offer looks at them and give them opportunities to talk? I think the answer is yes, if you read in great detail and consume a lot of journalism over a period of time. But on any given day or in any given week, maybe not so much. So as you're reading through the paper or web pages or listening to radio or television broadcasts, I just ask that you think about the complexity of issues here. You probably know people, either family or neighbors or friends, who have strong feelings. Just consider what those feelings are and how effectively they are covered in the press. Maybe not on a daily basis, but let's say on a weekly basis. And I think that you should bring that context or that complexity to thinking about immigration coverage. Next week's topic is coverage of race, which I think is equally complex. And later in the semester, we'll be talking about coverage of healthcare and coverage of food supply. And maybe those issues are not as emotionally charged as immigration and race, but they're still complex nonetheless. So I think the lesson this week is less clear than in previous weeks. It's simply to be aware of the complexity and try to find media coverage that reflects that complexity and that doesn't see things as simple matters of right or wrong, but reflects the range of public opinion. And to do that, you may have to look at several different news sources or more just to see if you can find that goal. So I'm sure this is an issue you're all aware of and that you think about, and I'm curious to hear what you have learned in reading about it this week. So I will be sending out in a little while a simple question that asks you to respond in not so many words, and just tell me something about what you have found and what you think on this front. Again, my apologies for providing you this information so late in the week, and I will try to be more timely in coming weeks. Thanks.